In this video, we cover Azure with a particular focus on the authentication methods. We'll look at Blob, which has three, the service principal, which is common to both Azure solutions, the OAuth token, and the token from file method. We'll also look at Databricks, which has three methods as well. We find the service principal, the personal access token, and again, token from file. Note that if you deploy Databricks in AWS, then the only available method is the personal access token. Azure is Microsoft's suite of cloud products, and so one of the more prevalent methods for accessing the services is the Azure Service Principal. This is a type of identity defined in Entra, which is the cloud version of Active Directory. At the outset, an organization has an Entra directory, which stores users who are given roles and access privileges to cloud applications, provided these applications are registered in Entra. When this happens, a tenant is assigned to the organization. The tenant ID is the organization's ID. Then, if either Blob or Databricks is registered in Entra, then role-based access control is activated for those applications. As a result, you can use the service principal to trigger processes in either product using Automic. You would use the Entra workspace to register the Blob application. This immediately generates a client ID for the application and a tenant ID. Then you head to Client Credentials and add a client secret with a description, Automic. Together, this forms the service principal called Automic, which we can see in display name. Then we head to our storage account and select the container which Automic needs to reach. We add a role assignment, select the service principal Automic we created earlier, and give it the storage blob data contributor role. This allows Automic to execute tasks on the container's blobs, download, delete, and so forth. Make sure you always assign the most appropriate role, one that provides sufficient but not excessive privileges. For example, if you need to read a blob, then the viewer role will be enough. There's no need to go beyond that. To use a service principal, the connection objects must connect to the Azure Active Directory, or Entra, URL. You notice the defaults, login.microsoftonline.com. This is the Microsoft 365 login portal. Because you're submitting a request for an Azure resource with the service principal, this request will be handled by Entra. As we explained, every organization relying on Azure services is given a tenant ID, which was assigned to the organization when its directory was created. The client ID and client secret form the unique ID of the Entra registered application. The secret is the password associated with the client ID. It's generated automatically when the application is registered. Working with a cloud application means authorizing but also accessing. Service principals rely on OAuth tokens to enable access to available resources once directory identification has been validated. A request is submitted, a token is issued, and the application becomes accessible by the requester. You'll need to set either version 1 or version 2, depending on what the application is using. This is technical in nature, and there's plenty of literature available online. Nonetheless, V1 provides access to a resource and V2 to a scope. They're essentially the same thing. We have to provide either one, depending on the version. These are values set by Microsoft, but you'll be able to modify them in the future in the form field if Microsoft ever changes them. The next method is token from file. This creates an authentication mechanism for individuals who cannot use service principals or are looking for the convenience and transportability of a single file. And so we package all that service principal information, workspace URL, tenant ID, client ID, and so forth, in a token file. The major advantage of this method is you can set expiration for better control. After this period, say 3 or 6 months, the token needs to be reissued. There are several methods for generating this token, such as the Microsoft Identity Platform REST API. You can use any tool like Postman to post a request for a token. In the post request, you specify the Azure Active Directory URL and the tenant ID, and in the parameters, you provide client ID and client secret and the scope. The request produces a string which you can save in a file. You place the file in a directory on the agent system and reference it here. You may run into token persistence issues, as the token may expire after a while. Use a simple Automic REST job to generate tokens automatically in a file and then reference the file in the con object. In the previous slide, we mentioned that the token from file method is hampered by persistence issues. The token will expire in very short cycles. For this reason, we're providing an example of REST-based methods to have Automic generate tokens automatically. This is fairly advanced and another reason for us to insist that you should use the service principal whenever possible, unless you're confronted with a specific situation preventing you from doing so. This approach requires the REST agent, and if you install it on the same system as the Blob agents, then the REST agent generates the file locally, and the local Blob agent can use it. As a first step, you must create a REST type connection to establish a connection to the Entra REST API. You create the con and add the Entra URL endpoints. You save and close. The second step involves creating a REST job. In the general section of the web service page, you add the con objects. Then you expand the web service page where you see two sections, request and response. In the request section under define requests, you select the request with request sheet option. Under request settings, you add the resource, which we mentioned earlier. It requires the tenant ID and the token details, OAuth 2 and the version. The method is always post. The media type provides several options, and we select URL encoded. In the form parameters, you need to specify 4 parameters. The grant type, which should always be client credentials, the scope, which we mentioned earlier, the client ID and client secret, which by now you're familiar with. The request post with these parameters. Obviously, for reusability, you can define variables in the object for tenant ID, and client secret if you don't want to type them here. Finally, you have to parse for the response. The parsing type should be JSON path. You output to a file name and path, and this needs to be a match for the information you're going to specify in the Blob connection object under the token from file method, which we mentioned earlier. The expression should be access token. You save the job, schedule it alongside your Blob object at set frequencies, say 55 minutes, if your token is set to expire every hour. Automic will be requesting a new token continuously so that your Blob jobs can execute without any problems. Finally, the last method is the OAuth 2 token. This is extremely simple. It's the same method as token from file, except we're not storing the token string in a file. We're just copying it in the string fields. Databricks has 3 authentication methods. The service principal and token from file are already covered. Let's discuss the personal access token. This type of token exists for a variety of reasons, like supporting Databricks implementations non-integrated in Azure or Entra. You can generate a token in Azure, for example, if a user isn't comfortable circulating service principal details to a third-party application like Automic. The personal access tokens, or PATs, exist in the original Databricks system and are not specific to either Azure or AWS. If Azure, they differ from the service principal token in that they're tied to a specific member account. You can log into the Databricks workspace, or Azure, access the user settings, head to personal access tokens, and generate the token. Assuming that all necessary authorization and access information has been stored in the member account, the system produces a long string of characters, which you can copy here.